Well, as I announced earlier, this is, of course, the season of Advent. And Advent is a time for two things, particularly. It's a time when, strangely, we try to become deliberately more aware of the world's incompleteness and its disorder. We recognise more acutely the fact that things are not as they should be. They need to be put right. And the second thing we concentrate on during Advent is trying to reawaken our longing for God to do precisely that. For God to bring about his new creation, his new heavens and new earth. And of course, that may be something that happens over a fairly long time horizon, we don't exactly know, but we focus our minds, and especially if we're kids, we focus our minds on a shorter term thing, we focus on Christmas. We start to look at Christmas. And in a sense, the kids are our leaders at this time of year, because in their anticipation and their hopefulness, they are showing us what true longing is like. Because all of us, I think, sense, at least, even people who don't know much about the Christian faith, sense that somehow in this baby born in Bethlehem, order is returning to a disordered and out of shape world. And so, like the kids watching under the Christmas tree, we're longing for the present to be unveiled and unwrapped, but we also know that we have to wait. Now, the problem, though, with Christmas is that Christmas is very prone to being overly sentimentalised and being turned into rather saccharine kind of images. And so as we focus on Christmas as a time of fulfilment, it's tempting to ignore the fact that when God's promises are fulfilled, they are fulfilled in a way that brings about tremendous disruption and chaos. God's promises, if they're like a present under a tree, it's like they're wrapped in something really unpleasant, like sandpaper. They're not presented to us very neatly all the time. And I think in our readings today, that's what we're called to particularly notice. They show us, these readings, they show us our hope. They are readings saturated in hopefulness. But they also remind us that the arrival of God's promise into the world is not something that is seamless, and it's not something that comes without disrupting our lives in a fairly fundamental way. Yes, it's true that through God's intervention in the world, order is returning. Rescue is coming, but this order will not be neat and it will not be seamless. God's rescue is like an icebreaker coming to rescue us. We're trapped in the ice. Rescue is coming, but the front edge of that icebreaker, the bow, is breaking up the ice. It's shattering everything it touches. And I think that's an image of what Jesus is describing and what our readings describe in terms of the kingdom of God. When the kingdom of God comes into contact with the icy kingdoms of this world, the arrival of God's order is announced by a shattering disorder, fragmentation, and even a sense of violence. Our Old Testament readings, let's just look at them very briefly. Our Psalm 80. Clearly, if you notice nothing else, you'll have noticed this is a psalm full of longing, asking the Lord to restore us, to show us the light of your countenance. It's a sense that the light's not shining at the moment. We long for the day when it will. And then the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah begins by asking that the Lord will tear open the heavens and come down. God's arrival in the world, according to our Isaiah reading, will be a violent one. The heavens will be torn open. It's an image of volcanic activity, of earthquakes and tremendous heat. In verse 2, as when fire kindles brushwood and the fire causes water to boil. God's arrival brings intense heat, and intense heat is just as likely to cause discomfort as it is to cause healing. The arrival of God's salvation brings a heat that is life to some, but it also is a heat that causes water to boil. Maybe the difference between heaven and hell is not ultimately a difference of temperature. Maybe it's a difference in our capacity to be open to the splendour of God's brightness and God's greatness. Any genuine intervention by God in our lives, whether it's the ultimate one at the end of time or whether it's any of these other interventions that happen in the midst of our journey, at any point where God invades our lives, he does it in a disrupting manner. It's not neat. It's not straightforward. If you think of the story of Israel, we can see this. Deliverance happens in some remarkable ways, but it happens alongside injustice and oppression and frankly some very weird events in the natural order. Or you think of the ministry of Jesus. Yes, Jesus is the one who restores order. He heals the sick. He causes the lame to walk. But the ministry of Jesus is accompanied everywhere by tremendous disorder. Violent passions are stirred up. Innocent people are murdered. Demonic activity rages. The great acts of salvation, particularly Christ's crucifixion and especially, I think, his resurrection and his ascension, these are all clear disruptions to the natural order of things. So it seems to me that in our hope for God's order to overcome the world's disorder, we have to remember the disrupting way that it might arrive. Yes, God is a God of order. Yes, God's creation has a deep ordered harmony about it and design to it. But we must remember that God's order is not like our order, and where his kingdom touches ours, it's ours that shatters. The point of contact between our world and God's promises is a point of tremendous and often ferocious disruption. Let's look a little more closely at Mark chapter 13, the words of Jesus that we had read to us before. Jesus is speaking to his disciples of the times of disorder that are coming. He's saying these words from the Mount of Olives. He's overlooking the temple, and he's prophesying all kinds of terrible storm-like events that are coming. It's a very difficult passage to make sense of, but it begins with Jesus prophesying the destruction of the temple, which itself is interesting because the temple is the sign of God's order, his ordered cosmos, an ordered universe. The temple was like the thing that held the whole creation together. But Jesus anticipates and predicts and prophesies that it's going to be destroyed. And the disciples say to him, well, when is this going to happen? And when Jesus answers them, his focus is very much not on when it will happen, but on when it won't happen. So he focuses on all the things that are not indications that the time has come. There are going to be false messiahs, he says. There are going to be wars. There are going to be earthquakes. There are going to be tremendous famines. Don't get too excited. That is just the start. Then he says there's going to be persecution. There's going to be families turning on themselves. There's going to be terrible sacrilege and besieging armies. People are going to say, look, here comes the Messiah. Don't believe them, he says. They're telling you lies. But then we come to verse 24, where Jesus says that then after that time, after that suffering, the sun will be darkened. Now, remember Isaiah had longed for God to tear open the heavens and come down. That seems to be what Jesus is now describing. Verse 25, the stars will be falling from heaven. The powers of the heavens will be shaken. Now, nothing represents order and control and stability quite like stars do. Stars are the best picture that the natural world gives us of order. They're high up there above all the flux and change of this world. Ancient peoples believed that the stars were heavenly beings who were ruling over the creation on God's behalf. Stars are about as ordered and as permanent as things get. And you know Victor Hugo's story, Les Miserables? And the character in that story is the Inspector Javert. Now, he is the representative of law and especially of order. He is the relentless pursuer of justice. For Javert, there are no exceptions. There is no place for mercy. There is no place for grace. Order and law must prevail. And in the musical version of this story, Javert has a theme song. And remember what it is? It's the stars. He's singing to the stars. And he describes the stars in these tremendous terms. You are the ones who fill the darkness with order and light. You are the sentinels, silent and sure, keeping watch in the night. And then he says, or he sings, you know your place in the sky. He's talking to the stars. You know your place in the sky. You hold your course and your aim. And each in your season returns and returns and is always the same. And if you fall as Lucifer fell, you fall in flame. See, to Javert, the stars are this wonderful image of the fixed order of this world. And it is almost unthinkable to him that the stars should fall from the heavens. And therefore it should be unthinkable that a criminal should escape from the consequences of their crime. And he knows that even if the stars do somehow fall from the heavens, they will fall in flame, in disgrace and defeat, like Lucifer fell. And if you know the story, then of course, one of the significant moments is when Rev'd comes face to face with something he cannot account for based on his view of an ordered universe. When he comes face to face with forgiveness, grace, mercy, something that comes from God, something that doesn't come from our human societies, he cannot cope with it, and it destroys him. God's order, when we experience it, is shattering. Jesus says that these stars, these symbols of order and permanence, will be shaken. They will fall from heaven. The heavens themselves will be torn open. This poses a real challenge to all of our efforts to impose order on the chaos of life. We are in a world that seems chaotic, and often our full-time job seems to be just imposing some order and control over much that we don't control. It's entirely understandable, and frankly, it's very healthy to tidy up your desk, pick up your socks, do all those things that bring a bit of order into the world. But we have to be very careful, because human attempts at imposing order are very often based on a lie that says that this is something that ultimately we can create without God. Our attempts often fail to allow for the disorienting reality of God. The most cruel governments in human history have been atheistic ones. And I don't think that's any accident, because there is no space in their system for something that cannot be contained or controlled. And so things like communism or fascism, for instance, impose order. You can understand the search for order, but without being conditioned or qualified by the presence of God, something we cannot control, this attempt at order becomes cruel. And a world that is ordered fully on our terms, and one that we can completely keep control over, is one that would ultimately keep God at bay forever. Because while God's tearing the heavens, we think it's our job to stitch them back up again. The Son of Man will come, Jesus says. He will come in the clouds with great power and glory. And his entry into our world will tear open the fabric of the universe and will cause it to convulse. There will be vast numbers of things that we have no control over. He will come, but the leading edge of his kingdom, as it tears through this universe, will be disorienting in the extreme. I have this sort of picture in my mind. God's kingdom is like a tsunami. It's roaring towards us, this wall of water coming towards us. It's unstoppable. Behind that wall, we can't see, but behind that wall is perfection, peace, calm. From the outside, from this side of the wall, it doesn't look that way. When the wall of water finally hits us and passes over it, its force and momentum will not, in the first instance, feel gentle. It needn't destroy us. All that is truly you is able to pass through that wall. The problem is there's much that we think is truly us that is not. That is a distortion and a disorder and a false love. The arrival of the kingdom must blast off of us all of our disordered loves, all of our chaotic desires, all of our attempts to impose our own order on the world. We and many of our fondest dreams must be excruciatingly dissolved by this wall before we can then be mended, reconstituted, healed on the other side. It feels like violence. It feels like disorder, but as a matter of fact, this is the pathway of entry into God's perfect peace. It is possible, in fact I would say it's likely, that for every person here in this room there are points in our life where there is tremendous disorder, where we do not feel in control at all. Now those areas might be invisible to other people. It might simply be in our emotional world. But it might be in our work life. It might be in our family life. Things in some dimension of our life, are almost certain to feel all tangled up and chaotic and out of our control. And yes, it's possible that those things are all just self-inflicted wounds and our job is to fix them up. There's no deeper significance than that. But there's another possibility. And it might be that we ought to be open to the thought that these dimensions of chaos and pain in our lives, these points of frustration, might in fact be the leading edge of what God is doing. But there is an element here of creative destruction, clearing away things that we would never choose to clear away for ourselves, but which need to be cleared away in order to enable something new and better to be put in its place. Sometimes surgeons need to break a bone in order to reset it properly. Isn't it possible that the chaos and the disorder that we feel may in fact be a sign of God's order coming close to us? It's only after these days of suffering, says the Lord. It's after the darkening of the sun and the stars falling from heaven. It's after the dissolution of the world that the Son of Man is unveiled. And like all of the disciples who are gathered around him in this conversation, we want to know when. We want to know specifics. Which bit of chaos is heralding the arrival of God? Which bit of chaos is the Son of Man drawing near? And which bits are just my own missteps? Which bits need to be fixed? There's so much that we don't know. And if you ever doubt that, just read Mark chapter 13. I don't know what half it's talking about. It's very confusing. Sometimes it seems that he's referring to the events of his crucifixion, which are days away. Sometimes it seems likely that he's talking about the siege of Jerusalem, which would see the temple and the whole city virtually destroyed in AD 70. Sometimes it seems as if he's speaking about his ultimate return in glory. We want to know specifics, but the desire to pin down specifics is precisely what Jesus seems to be discouraging here. What he wants to talk about is not times and dates. He wants to talk about us and our heart disposition. He wants to talk about how alert we are, how awake we are. In particular, he wants us to be alert to the possibility that the disorder and the mayhem in our world might be heralding the coming of the kingdom. Maybe the final and ultimate unveiling of the Son of Man at the end of time, or maybe a more immediate, more slight manifestation of the kingdom in our lives. God's order is coming, but as I said before, it's wrapped in what looks like a wall of destruction and violence and chaos. Which means that the wall of water that's rushing towards you, or the sense that the stars are falling from the sky and everything's out of place, it might mean the arrival of God's plan. But you won't recognise it unless you are awake. You won't recognise it unless you are alert. And so from verse 28, Jesus' message seems to be, the kingdom is very close. But if you are not alert, you won't recognise it. It will just look like chaos to you. It will just look like disorder and confusion. There'll be no silver lining. There'll be no greater purpose. It'll just be pain and suffering. Without alertness, life will make no sense. There'll be no ability to see the possibility of the order that is there behind the chaos. It's like, he says, it's like a man going on a journey. He puts the slaves in charge. And one of the slaves is the doorkeeper, and he tells him he's got to stay on watch. I have no personal experience of being a slave, except for about a year in my public service career, which I prefer not to dwell on. But I do know something about being a private in the army, which I think is even worse than being a slave. You have even fewer rights. Now to be a private in the army, at least in my experience, you don't need to be, this is how I got in, you don't need to be particularly bright. You don't need to be particularly good at anything. But you do have to be able to stay awake when you're tired. That's kind of the one thing that you have to be able to do. Most things are forgivable, but not falling asleep on picket. And that can be very difficult. If you've been going for weeks without much sleep, and you're fatigued and you're tired, it's the middle of the night, and it's 2 or 3 in the morning, you've got to stay awake for a couple of hours. It's hard work, but it's necessary to stay awake because the least likely time that the enemy is going to act is when you're expecting it. One day, a mate of mine told me that he was sitting next to me on picket the previous night, and he whispered, "G'day." And I said nothing. So he said it again, "G'day." And I said nothing. And he looked at me a bit closer in the darkness, and he saw that my eyes were open. I seemed to be alert, rifle in hand, but he couldn't get a response out of me. I had no memory of this happening at all. Now, I don't think I could have been charged for falling asleep on picket. There was no evidence that I was asleep. My eyes were wide open, apparently. But I also think probably a tank could have driven right up to me with flares flying in all directions and loud music playing, and I probably wouldn't have noticed. See, being awake is not enough. You also have to be alert. You have to be alert. You have to be alert to notice the disorder, but also to notice what's behind the disorder and to be able to anticipate the work of God that's taking shape and taking form behind that disorder. A very short time after Jesus says these words, he'll be with the disciples in the garden, and they will do exactly what he says not to do. They will fall asleep when he's asked them to stay awake. They will let him down. When they wake up, they are going to wake up to scenes of complete chaos and confusion. People shouting, Jesus being dragged away. It's going to be totally disorienting to them because their sleepiness did not allow them to recognise that what was happening was the fulfilment of God's plan. Stage one in the revealing of the Son of Man. As we look towards the promises of God being fulfilled, if we are not alert, all we will see is chaos. All we will see is frustration and disappointment. We might miss how those things herald and announce God's work in the world. So friends, this Advent, let's stay alert to the fact that God is here. God is at work, and his kingdom is most certainly coming. Certainly at the end of all things, but even in various ways in the here and now. And as we try to be attentive to what's going on behind the chaos and what God is doing, let's also keep our eyes scanning the far horizon. Because we know that the Son of Man, who is made known in so many ways in our disordered lives, is also coming in his glory to bring peace and order to the world. So as we await this day, let us stay awake and let us stay